Benefit of learning basic chords. In a prior presentation, we talked about 4 different methods or 4 different starting points common for different guitar instructors and different learners when learning the guitar, and how it would be best to think of them as 4 separate starting points that will basically be different roads leading to the same location at the end of the day, all converging at some point in time, and spend some of our time learning each of them. So that would include learning basic chords, which would help to memorize songs, learning basic scales like the pentatonic scale, learning power chords, and learning basic theory. So now we're going to go into each of these in a little bit more depth. In this presentation, we'll be talking about the basic chords that would be used then to play basic songs, putting together basic songs. So what are the benefits of learning basic chords? One is they're fun. It's fun to learn the basic chords because you can strum the entire guitar on it, so it's a good thing to be able to have. If you have just a couple basic chords, you can have a lot of fun with just a few basic chords. They allow you to play songs quickly. So the basic chords are going to be the building blocks of many songs, and many songs that are even more complex songs you can basically break down to a more simplified version with basically the basic chords. And once you have those basic chords down, if you want to play them in a different key or something like that, you can capo, and you can use the good old capo and move around and play a lot of different things with just a few basic chords. They help you to learn the open positions on the guitar. Or in other words, when you're learning the basic chord shapes, the open chord shape positions like a D chord, a C chord, a G chord, and so on and so forth, you're working down here on the base of the guitar, and you're maximizing, the goal here is to be maximizing the open positions on the guitar so that you can ring out as many of the strings as possible to make the chords that are being made, and that gives you kind of a fuller feel to the note. Really, you only need three strings. You only need 3 notes in order to make a major or minor chord. But if you can find those 3 notes in different orders on more strings than just simply 3 strings, then you got a different feel. You have a kind of a fuller type of note. They help you to learn the open positions on the guitar. Or in other words, when you're learning the basic chord shapes, then you're working down here on the base of the guitar. So when you're learning like a G shape or a D shape or a C shape, you're working down here and you're utilizing then the open positions on the guitar, meaning you're utilizing those items where you're not holding down a string and you're allowing the string to ring out in an open type of position. And that helps you to really kind of memorize this part of the guitar. You're working on this part of the guitar all the time. Then when you're using those major chord shapes, a D chord, a C chord, they help you to learn the open positions on the guitar. Or in other words, when you're working with the major chord shapes, the open position chord shapes like a D chord, a C chord, a G chord, you're working down here at the base of the guitar. Or if you were to see it in terms of this being like the neck of the guitar going from left to right and the largest string on top, then you're on this side of the guitar over here. And that helps you to learn this area of the guitar. It also helps you to learn the open positions, because when you play those major shapes, what you're trying to do is ring out as many of the strings as possible, and you're utilizing then the open position. So you want to be able to play chords. The chords are designed so that they can play as many of the strings as possible, basically in those open positions. So any string that you're not holding down and still playing within that chord shape, you're playing basically in the open position. So you'll get really good at playing in this area of the guitar then when you do that. And then later on, of course, you're going to be wanting to move up and move around the guitar, and we'll have to talk about methods to do that, which you can do with some of these other starting points that we'll talk about as well. That's why they go together nicely. Chords also allow you to practice picking and strumming. So if you just hold down even just one chord, you can really practice your strumming. It's a lot more fun to practice your strumming with that chord being held down, and you can practice alternating between strumming and picking if you so choose. And again, even if you're just holding down one chord, each chord, whether it be a minor chord or a major chord, the typical types of chords, will have 3 notes within it, some of those notes then repeating. So if you just pick one string at a time within each chord, you have basically an infinite amount of combinations when you put into rhythms and different patterns, even with just one chord that you're playing. So you can practice picking around on it. You can also practice a hand style type of picking with your thumbs and your fingers of the strings, as opposed to using a pick. So there's really a whole lot you can do with even just one pattern or just one chord shape being held down, practicing your strumming, your picking with both a pick and your fingers. Once we learn these patterns, we'll see that these patterns are going to be movable, and you'll see this often referred to as like a caged type of system, that these patterns can then be taken and moved up. Now this is where things often get a little bit confusing, and we'll talk about more in a future presentation, because this kind of merges into when we think about different patterns as we move up the neck, which gets into like scales, pentatonic scales, major scales, and so on and so forth. So that's when the roads start to kind of converge, when you take these shapes and then want to kind of move them around. But just by learning the shapes by hand, even if you don't know, what the chords are within the shape, then it'll be easier to see the concept of that shape. Once you start seeing the shape, that you can move that shape up. And then you start thinking about what's the impact of moving that shape up, and how does moving that shape up fit into some other things that we're going to start to learn, that you'll start to be picking up, such as scales, pentatonic scales, major scales, and so on. Do these shapes fit in to those other scales, those other shapes that you're learning? They do. How are they related, and so on. So again, this is an area where we start to converge on something we'll talk about in the future, which will be another kind of starting point that we want to basically start in on and start learning at the same time. And that's going to be that the chord shapes can be seen as fitting into or as being part of 5 pentatonic shapes and 5 major scale shapes. So we'll start talking about those shapes, learning them basically separately. And then as we start to move forward, you'll see that these things kind of converge together. In other words, when you look at the open position, you're going to be working here at the end of the guitar, or if you look at it this way, you're going to be working here in frets, 1 through 2, or 0 through 2 or 3 or so. And then when you start learning the shapes of the guitars, then you can find an area. There's different ways that you can learn this we'll talk more about in the future, but you can start learning those shapes more in the middle of the guitar, which will allow you to basically learn 2 different components of the guitar, and then you'll see how they can kind of combine together as you move forward. You'll say, well, these shapes kind of fit into, these movable shapes I've been learning down here kind of fit into these pentatonic shapes, and these pentatonic shapes kind of fit into the shapes that could be the major scale shapes. Online resources. There's a whole lot of resources using this basic kind of method, because I think it's one of the more motivational type of methods to get people straight to the songs as quickly as possible. So you can find a lot of resources on how to play basic chords, and then how to play basic songs within them, both in terms of finding basic song lists that are composed of basic chords, and looking for your own songs, whatever songs you want to play. There's a lot of resources out there that people have kind of figured them out and put them together. If you want someone that teaches this online, that uses this kind of method, in my opinion, kind of tries to get to the songs as quickly as possible. I like, this guy has a Justin Guitar channel. He has a beginning course channel. His YouTube channel is here, so you can go to that link and check that out. And he also has a website, and on his website, he's got this beginner guitar lesson, which I think is free. So that's a good place to start too. And then at the end of some of his sections, he puts this list of songs that you can start to play that would be using the new skills, basically the chords that you would be putting together in the lesson, which is nice. So then you can go in there and pick some, any song that is familiar to you, whatever you're into, and try to play that through. In future presentations, we'll talk about the other 3 of 4 starting points that go along with our theme of basically thinking about these 4 starting points when we're starting as separate components, but having the vision that they will come together in the future. Having that vision that they'll come together is helpful to incentivize us to move forward. So let's think about how they could come together. The next thing we'll talk about will be scales. We're going to talk about the pentatonic scale, which is probably the most common scale that people will start to learn on the guitar. How do these shapes then feed into, how are they related to, how would the roads converge to the pentatonic scale? So first, let's analyze one chord in an open position, and that chord's going to be the C chord. So if we map this thing out, then this is going to be the nut of the guitar, the way this is mapped out. This is fret 1, fret 2, fret 3. And then we have the biggest string on top, the way this is mapped out, and the smallest string on the bottom here. So if you map it out in this format, then when you play a C position in the open position, then you'd be holding down in fret 3 the A string, this item, which would be a C. Fret 2 on the D string, you'd be holding down on fret 2, which would be an E. You would hold nothing down on the G string, which would be an open position. The nut here would be open. And then on the B string, you'd be holding down position 1 or fret 1, which would be a C. And then on the last string, on the E string, you wouldn't be holding anything down, which would be an E. Now, most people don't get into the C, the E, the G, what they're holding down. They're just holding down the shape. They probably do want to learn this one because this is the one that's going to be leading. This tells you it's a C typically. This is the dominant item of the chord typically in the open position. But many people are just learning the shape at this point in time and trying to get your fingers to work more than trying to learn the theory of it. If you do map it out like this and learn the theory of it, then you're kind of blending in with theory. You're going to start to say, well, why is this put together? There's only 3 notes here and I'm holding down 5 strings because a major chord's only made of 3 notes and whatnot. And you'll go on that, and that kind of blends into the theory type of things, and those things will converge together. But the next thing we're talking about is scales then. How does this fit into the scales? The scales that we're going to learn are going to be the pentatonic scale, because that's going to be the most common scale pattern that people will start to learn. Works really well on the guitar. It blends into it and is part of the major scale. So if you know the major scale and you want to see how that fits together, then we'll take a look at that too. But once you think about this shape, the next thing that people typically will think about is, well, how does that fit into scales, or how can I move that thing up along the neck? How can I move it to some other position? And to do that, you're going to hear like the caged system. The caged system will allow you to move it. But when you move it, then it gets a little bit confusing, because obviously you have the C position that you're going to move, which is now a C position in your mind, but it's a different note pattern. You'll also be learning these scales, like a pentatonic scale. And you might say, well, how does this position then fit into the scale patterns that you'll learn? Which I would suggest learning separately, learning the scale patterns like the pentatonic scale in the middle of the neck. So you can work these down on the end. So you're learning the open positions, then you can learn the scale patterns at the middle of the neck. And then when you start to move these things around, you'll say, well, how do these things fit together? So for example, this is going to be a pentatonic position. I would call it position number 4. That's somewhat of an arbitrary naming. I'll tell you why that is. It's kind of arbitrary, but many people would probably, call it that or think of it that way in their mind. And this is going to be a scale pattern. This is going to be a pentatonic scale pattern that you can just learn on the guitar, which will take the 7. We'll talk more about it in the future. But many people will learn these patterns, these pentatonic scale patterns. And if you learn them separately, then you'll start to see, well, how does the caged system, or in other words, how do these chord shapes, do they fit into these scale patterns that we're learning? We're going to learn 5 different scale patterns. And the answer is yes, right? Every scale pattern will kind of line up to, if I was to take this and put it into this pentatonic shape we're learning, then you can find that within the pentatonic shape. And that would take the pentatonic scale, 5 notes, and break it down into the 3 notes that make up the A major chord within it, in this case still the C chord, because we're in the open position. So that's how they kind of blend together. So we'll learn them separately. If you learn the pentatonic scale starting in the middle of the neck, then you can move around the pentatonic scale. You can learn the open notes at the end of the neck, learning the open positions, and then they'll kind of blend together. Now, the pentatonic scale is usually what people start to learn because it's a really nice scale to use on the guitar. But you might say, well, how does that fit into like the major scale, And you can then learn basically the major scale in each of the 5 positions, which would look like this. So now these would be, so obviously these red items are position C. The dark blue items would be the pentatonic scale in position 4. I would call it position 4. And then if we go here, we'd say, okay, what if I add like the major scale? Well, then you're just basically adding the rest of the notes, which would be the major scale. So now we've got basically the major scale, that would be the light blue, have now been added. Minor scale over here, the pentatonic scale over here, all the blue items, including the blue with the red numbers. Over here, major scale now, all the blue items, light blue, dark blue, and the red numbers. Everything but the black areas would be included in this pattern. And this pattern is really nice because you can start to actually play it and memorize, get a feel for where the notes are. In other words, you can play this, and as you play, you can say your alphabet, your musical alphabet. E, F, G. This is how you would play it. First string, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And you can start to play it backwards. And so having this pattern then in multiple areas, if you learn that, then you can actually you'll start to actually naturally, and you actually say the alphabet while you're playing it, you'll actually start to see where different things lie in terms of the notes on the guitar. You'll be able to see the fretboard in terms of notes a little bit more clearly, which is something that's really, takes some time to do. That takes a long time to do.